All right, welcome everybody to the NAFSA Tech MIG Fall webinar series. Today's topic is how to advocate for investments in technology, and we appreciate you guys joining us. My name is Alex Paisner. I am one of the co-chairs of the Tech MIG, and presenting today is Denver Miller, and Denver Miller works at the uh, at the International Honors Program within the SIT Study Abroad. He lives up in New England, and he's currently pursuing his master's in international ed at the SIT Graduate School. He studied abroad for 3 semesters, and he works intimately with a lot of the students who are participating related to the International Honors Program at SIT. As a technology expert and one who has had to advocate for the use of technology and the investment on behalf of his organization, he's going to talk a little bit about how to warrant or how to make the argument to warrant investment in technology for you at your campus. And we're also going to give some insight from both the institutional perspective and also from the third-party perspective, and we're going to save some room at the end for questions. This is GoToWebinar that we are using, and as you have questions, there is a questions box that you'll be able to type right into, and we definitely want to, again, leave some room at the end, so definitely feel free to type in your questions, and Denver or I will certainly tackle them. Thank you again so much for joining us, and I will let Denver take it away. Hey, Denver, can you hear us?
I can. Thanks, Alex, for the intro. So, again, thank you everyone for attending, and welcome to the TechMig webinar series. So, jumping right into the introduction, this is something that is a relatively common instance and problem in our field. How many times has this happened to you? It's basically you're asked to increase productivity and maintain the same level of service in the face of budget cuts and shifting resources. Asking for impressive outputs without investing in those systems is neither sustainable nor feasible. Really, no one knows your job better than you do. You are the one who knows the ins and outs of your position, and you are the one who knows where the efficiencies can be found. Oftentimes, the efficiencies are revealed when you find yourself saying to yourself, there has got to be a better way of doing this. So the aim of this webinar is to give you the tools to advocate for the department or your role, and obtain those tools that you'll need to fulfill your organization's mission. So what we'll be doing is reviewing a tool called the Advocacy Planning Cycle and seeing it in action and how I implemented it at our organization. There's going to be a few minutes at the end for Q&A, so definitely feel free to think of a couple questions, jot them down, and I'll be addressing those at the end. As Alex mentioned, these are the folks who are going to be joining us this afternoon. Ross Mason's the Vice President of Envisage International Corporation, who is basically works with the insurance needs and specializes in the insurance of our field. Alex is the Enrollment and Marketing Director at Global Experiences, which provides customized internship opportunities worldwide. And as Alex mentioned, I'm Denver Miller of SIT Study Abroad. I actually work with it's called the International Honors Program, or IHP. And what we do is we run semester-long comparative programs that are field-based and experiential learning focused. And we tackle such topics as human rights, climate change, health, and urbanization. So they're exciting programs, but they are definitely programs that require a lot of logistical moving parts, and it requires appropriate technology to keep up with that. So what we're going to do next is basically dive right into the advocacy planning cycle. As I mentioned in the introduction, the advocacy planning cycle, or APC as I'm going to call it for short, it was a tool developed by a London-based organization called WaterAid in 2007. It's available in their publication, the Advocacy Sourcebook, and I'm going to publish a link to that at the end of the slideshow. Now, the APC is a 10-step method for planning how to approach any sort of advocacy work. The steps are listed here, and what we're going to do is we're going to go into each step in much greater detail in the upcoming slides. So this model is fantastic, and I really enjoyed learning it and using it. But what we're going to do is use a case study to kind of see the theoretical model in place and then how the APC actually works in the real world. Through the course of this presentation, I'm going to be relating the underlying model to the actual piece of technology that we advocated for in our office. So, steps 1 through 3. The APC basically begins with identifying the issue. If you can take time at the beginning to really ask yourself, what's at the core of what you've been asking for? And that's key, and it's really going to shape the rest of the cycle. By performing an analysis on this issue, you really get a chance to get to the root of the problem. Often by asking the issue with multiple people, either from multiple departments or multiple points of view, you can really discover what you thought was the issue is actually a symptom of a much larger issue. So that's the importance of involving lots of people and really identifying the issue at its core. Really the big, important, continual question that you want to ask is why, and I can't overstate that enough. Every organization is different, but to some degree, we all fall into that trap of, well, we do it this way because it's always been done this way. And asking why breaks that cycle. It opens up the opportunity to really explore what's going on. So in our case, we had a combination of some old hardware in terms of the computers and technology that we were using. It was really glitchy and slow and was slowing us down, and it really took away from our ability to really run effective programs. Having also the right software in place, it was really cutting into the time it took to really effectively run our programs. So in our case, it was really just a simple question of trying to figure out what hardware and software we needed to implement. But again, the goal of this whole webinar series is not what did we do and what worked well in our situation, but the goal is to provide you all a tool that you can use for your advocacy in your organizations, because what you may be asking for is completely different based on what your needs are. So again, asking that question of why breaks the cycle and really opens things up to more questions. So what do you want? That's step 3, it's setting objectives. The most effective APCs really have a defined set of outcomes. So you really have to ask, what does success look like? And how do you know when to stop? Because once you actually know what your end goal is, you're in a much better place to really know when you've actually reached that finish line. So the next steps are 4 through 6. So while steps 1 through 3 of the APC gave you a problem, gave you a starting point and an ending point, the next 3 steps deal with creating a plan to cross that goal. So the first thing that we're going to do is identify who has the power to grant you what you want. It would be a really big waste of time to really try and influence someone who ultimately doesn't have the power or ability to make that decision. And that's where step 4 comes in, which is identifying your targets. So who are the decision makers in your organization? And number 2 is, who can influence those people? So the second bullet point really talks about how in some instances you yourself may not have the organizational influence or the power to influence the decision maker directly. But if you can actually influence an influencer or decision maker, so think of that second level back, you actually have the ability to change your approach, which can sometimes make all the difference. I'll get to that in a little bit more detail in another step. So the next is defining the message. And the message kind of changes based on the values of the person that you're trying to speak with. So you really have to tailor it to your audience. So whereas one person in the organization might be swayed by an appeal to the organization's mission, vision, and purpose, another person in your organization might be really concerned with how your organization and your proposal improves the bottom line, which then allows the organization to fill its organizational mission and vision and what have you. So really, different audiences have different buttons, and that really speaks to you having to know your audience and your approach. So make sure that you're basically tailoring that ask to the audience and listening to their values. The next thing that you want to do is assess your resources. So it's up to you to really think about what you have at your disposal. what you can do for that really is you'll look at the confines of what you actually have in order to make this happen. Now, we all know resources are at a premium, and really everything costs something. So there's an opportunity cost to your time that you're going to spend on advocating and lobbying for this change and this initiative to take place, as well as political capital. You, in your organization, you have to be very selective and decisive with what you choose and how you choose to make those asks. So you need to make sure that before you actually dive into advocating for this particular project or what have you, that you actually have enough of whatever resources you need to make this happen. So what we've covered so far is the problem, the starting point, the ending point, your target, your message, and your resources. So now what we're actually going to talk about is the actual implementation phase. So step 7 is the actual delivery. Just as important as the words that you say, the way in which you make that ask can make all the difference. So that's what's really important here. This request is basically, it's best made as either a formal presentation, or perhaps it's an email, or it might be made informally at a gathering, or maybe just taking a walk with that person. The only person who can really know what the best approach is you and your team that you're using to kind of craft this advocacy plan. So you are the one who has to really think about in this planning phase what your approach is going to be, because just in the last phase where we actually looked at who is your audience and what are their values, they each might have different approaches that might work best for them. So the next step is identifying your allies. The people who can work well with you to help you achieve all of these outcomes and that benefit all parties. And one of the things that I felt that was also very important is identifying the people who might oppose your plan. So just as the best laid plans really have a plan for success, the best laid plans, in my opinion, also have a contingency for things that might work against your favor. We've all, I'm assuming, encountered something like this before, where your plan, as well-intentioned as it might be, it might create more work for someone else, or it might take resources away from another department. If that's the case, be prepared to address that person's concerns, because you can bet that person is going to challenge you on that. So if you can think about that ahead of time, about who might oppose your plan or who might take issue with what you're trying to propose, and approach them in a way that actually helps bring them in line with what you're trying to achieve, and explain how your solution can benefit them, then that'll go a long way into helping make sure that your plan is as successful as it can be. So we talked earlier about having multiple angles of approach. Leveraging your relationships with the influencers of the influencer can make that, of the decision maker rather, can sometimes be the key to getting things done. Depending on where you are in your organization, you may or may not have direct organizational power over someone. Unlike, for example, if you have the dynamic between a boss and an employee, it's pretty easy to say, okay, my boss can tell me to do X, Y, Z. Well, if you go up and over in the organizational chain and you really don't have any direct oversee power over this person or this institution, then it might be really hard for you to exert influence over them other than asking politely. But if you can think about it in a different way, or if you can make a convincing argument to someone who has influencing power or direct relational power over the person who can make your decision, then that's going to really help you. And that's definitely something that you'll want to keep in mind as you're thinking about your approach. So the next step is really talking about the institutional or the advocacy plan itself. This is huge, and this is something that unfortunately there's really not enough time in this webinar to really talk about this bullet point about drawing up an advocacy action plan. However, WaterAid's publication does a superb job of really walking us through how that's actually done. So they're really big enough that they could create their own webinars each on these points. So what I'll say for now is that's another topic for another show. What I'd like to say, though, is at the end of this webinar, I actually post a link to the WaterAid Advocacy Planning Guide. So I encourage you all to check it out, learn more about that resource, and learn more about creating an advocacy action plan, and then also how to monitor and evaluate the results to make sure that the advocacy plan that you put in place is actually taking shape and actually progressing the way you're looking forward to. Now, to see how this actually works in the real world, what I'd like to do briefly is talk about what I actually did in terms of advocating for new technology within our organization. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that we had some trouble with some existing technology and not having the correct software to really help us perform in the way that we were hoping to. What I did actually, though, is actually made an adaptation of the APC and did a revision of the order of steps. Because no model is perfect and there is no one solution that's ever going to fit all instances, I did a minor modification. So this made sense in our case. Now, what we did was we decided that before we could really identify our targets, we wanted to have a full understanding of the resources behind us, the allies that were working with us, and the potential opposition that stood before us. So what we did was we took the existing advocacy planning cycles, 10 steps, and we did a brief reorder. So we took steps 6 and 8 and we put them before identifying targets, and they became our new step 4 and 5. What this did was it allowed us to really take stock of our position, and it left us in a much better place to make our request. So you may be wondering how my specific case ended. Let me talk about that a little bit more. So what we did in terms of identifying the issue we already talked about, by performing an analysis, what we did, I spoke with other people in our department, but also with other units on campus to see if they were experiencing similar issues with the systems and programs that were in place. And it was definitely something that wasn't just our department that was experiencing this. So by sitting down and looking at number 3, which was our objectives, we really thought to ourselves, okay, what do we want to do? What does an end result look like? And what does a satisfactory end look like? And also, what are some compromises? Where are we willing to decide, okay, hey, we may not be able to ever get 100% of what we ask for. Here's our things that we absolutely must have, and here are the things that we might be willing to give and take on, because that's what compromise is all about. Next, we actually moved into, again, the switching up of the model. So our number 4 was addressing or assessing our resources. We actually had a fair number of people that were in a number of positions that were actually relatively high up in our organization. So those were what we deemed to be kind of our heavy hitters in terms of being able to really influence others by their positionality within our organization, and also frankly, their way with people. They're very eloquent. They have a great personability and people-to-people skills. So really, those people became our spokespersons. We looked to also the existing resources we had in terms of our time. We decided to really look at when's the best time of year to make this ask. We looked at when the budgeting cycle took place, so that we could make sure that we didn't ask for more budgetary things after the budgetary cycle had concluded. We also took into consideration when our most busy time of year was, because we really couldn't devote extra time to lobbying for extra resources at a time when we were the most busy gearing our students up to be ready to depart. So moving on to our new step 5, which was identifying our allies. As I mentioned earlier, I wasn't the only department that was experiencing this issue. So by reaching out to other units on campus, we could really approach the decision makers to say, this isn't just our department being a squeaky wheel. This is a much broader issue that we'd like to bring to your attention. And by leveraging other people at the same time, we were able to say, this is how it's impacting others. And by having a synergistic effect of putting all this technology together, you're actually going to have really a multiplier of the benefits of this. So that was one of the reasons that we decided to identify our allies early. Identifying the targets, in our case, it was relatively easy. We actually were, because it was a technological ask, we involved the IT department, and we also had to involve some of the people in finance to really be the ones to make the decision, the final decision on releasing the funds to make it happen. Defining the message really fell to basically deciding what the best person was, or really it was tailored based on the sensibilities of the people that we were speaking to. For the people that were in the finance department, because they work with numbers and budgets all day, being able to make our ask and approach in a financial way to actually show what made sense financially, that was speaking their language, and that was meeting them where they are. Whereas when we approached other people within the organization, we tailored a message to say, our aim is to provide the best possible program for our students. In order to do so, we need time to basically set up our programs and actually spend time delivering the content and not spending time waiting for our systems to catch up with us. So by freeing up or providing us with the resources that we need to free up our time to actually deliver our content, we're having much better service to our students and delivering on our mission, which as an organization was very important to those people. Actually provide. So that really falls into defining the message and the approach. The actual advocacy plan itself was actually a multi-page document that I worked on with several other people. It was very data-driven so that we could actually provide not just anecdotal evidence, but really data-based decision or data-based information so that the decision makers could really see that, yes, what we're talking about is backed up by facts. So that's definitely something that, again, if you have time to really dive into the advocacy planning model as well as the advocacy action plan that WaterAid makes in their document, I highly encourage you to look at it because it's definitely a wonderful thing. So as I see, we're actually doing just fine on time. What I'm going to do is actually just move a little bit ahead in the slideshow here and actually move it to the next slide, which is actually the link to WaterAid's advocacy sourcebook, which again, that's available here, but I know this webinar is going to be published and available online, so don't worry about hurrying to write this down. And what I'm going to do is when we actually go to the Q&A time, I'm going to actually leave this up for a while so people can copy this link down and also leave up the slide with our contact information, so if you have more questions, you can actually contact us directly. So wrapping up, basically the story of at least our model, by going back and actually changing WaterAid's advocacy planning cycle ever so slightly for our situation, it worked really well. We ended up getting the technology that we were hoping for. We had a lot of great institutional support from a lot of different departments, and that was great because I really feel like we took the time to really follow the planning cycle and really build a strong case with lots of allies and really think about what we wanted to do. It ultimately ended up being a successful advocacy effort. So this is an example of the advocacy planning cycle in the real world, and I'm hoping that the 10 steps that WaterAid laid out for you guys in the planning cycle is a tool that you guys will then be able to take forward to your institutions, and depending on the technology needs of your institution and your department, you can take this cycle and decide what the best methods are for you, and hopefully you'll be able to have similar positive results. So moving on, before we end up at the Q&A section, I wanted to bounce it back to Alex or Ross to see if you guys had any additional inputs, questions, maybe talk a little bit about your own institutional experience with something similar. And then this slide here with Connect with Us, I will leave up during the Q&A session. So I will now take this back to Alex for the Q&A, and if any other attendees have any questions, now is the time to think about posting those either in the comments section of the webinar, and we'll go from there. Alex?
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Denver. This is a really helpful framework to really evaluate, get organized, and the implementation stage, obviously key. Coming from personal experience and global experiences is a third-party provider. We're a bit smaller with about 30 employees, and so not a massive institution by any means. For us, in the way that we tend to advocate for technology, a lot of decision makers can be kind of stuck in a mindset of there are hard costs and there are soft costs, and oftentimes the amount of time that it takes an individual to do something that a technological solution could solve, oftentimes that doesn't get calculated out. But we find that when we're able to frame a technology solution as how many hours it will save one of our employees, that becomes a very quick, clear way to help frame it in a context that uh, makes it look like a no-brainer in terms of whether that is our staff needs new laptops, or we need a CRM solution or an email management solution to help us, send out automatic emails to students and confirmations. It's one of those things where the actual man hours and the human capital that goes towards particular functions that technology can potentially solve is where at least we get the most traction. Let's see, Ross has a great question just to pose to both of us, Denver. When advocating for investment in technology, what are some of the most common roadblocks or problems that you have experienced, and how do you overcome them?
Sure, absolutely. I would say the first one is systems integration. And what I mean by that is making sure that different systems talk to each other. Um, let's say, for example, your department finds a solution that works extremely well for your team. You've done a little bit of research, you've gone back and forth, you might have talked to outside vendors, and you find a solution that works perfectly well for your team. And then you go and you try and implement it, only to find that other people within your organization or other departments, that new software solution doesn't talk with existing systems. It could be something like a financial, or it could be different outdated systems don't talk to one another, or it's not backwards compatible. But either way, you just spent a lot of time researching a solution that ultimately can't be implemented. So that's a very big and a real pitfall which can be avoided by, again, from the very beginning. What you want to do is, I believe it's step 2 or 3, which is basically performing an analysis, and that's really taking the time to really identify what solutions will work, and also involving other people from other departments to get in different points of view. Another barrier that I would say is that the amount of resources. We talked a little bit about time being a resource, employee time being something that, yeah, if you can have a time-saving solution, then it does make it a much more palatable solution for managers or other people to approach to say, yeah, that makes perfect sense. If it's going to save 4 hours a week of this employee's time, that's time that they can spend doing other things. But you're right, if a manager only sees the paper cost or the actual money that they would have to spend on it, but they don't take into consideration how much time or labor would be actually saved, then that's a problem. And it definitely begs the question, you might have to consider changing your approach to convince this particular person that this solution is a good idea. So maybe change the way in which you're talking about the solution in terms of how it can benefit the organization.
Yeah, and one example that I would throw out kind of related to that is in our particular case, we have someone who works on our staff that is in charge of accounts and billing, and spends a lot of the time sending updated invoices, double checking that things are correct in the system, contacting people who are overdue for payments, those kinds of things. Probably takes up easily about 30% of that particular job function and job role. She approached advocating for technology in a very similar to the approach technological solution will be able to cut that down by 70%, which will allow me to spend those actual man hours on other things, and to be able to present the alternatives that that time could be spent doing that is in fact more valuable that some technological solution could solve, frames it oftentimes in a context that is both if it can be attractive to the bottom line, but also appeal to that the visionary and the goal of people being able to do work that is outside of the real being stuck in the mud and just plodding forward. It becomes even more attractive.
Looks like there's another question on the side. Am I seeing someone else? Ross or Alex, is there another question coming from the audience?
Let's see. I think the one that Ross just posed was the main one that was in there. But I do have another one for you, Denver. Just in terms of the advocating without ruffling feathers. I know that that's usually a big factor for us in international education. Wanting to get things done, wanting to take the right approach, but being conscious of not going over our boss's head, that kind of thing. I guess, how do you have any pointers or suggestions for people in terms of striking that right balance between getting the job done, but also, still, the keeping everyone on the same team?
Absolutely, and that's a very human problem. Everyone has their idea of what's their turf or what's within their realm of what they're responsible for, and I don't think anyone appreciates being stepped over or overlooked or feel like their concerns are not heard. So the advocacy planning cycle really hopes to address that in the identifying your allies step. So when I talked about identifying the people that could also stand in opposition to you, thinking about how you can approach them and really think about if you are going to provide or present a plan that could ruffle feathers, think about how your actions will impact either their workflow, their workload, their resources, their time, and really approach them face to face. Everyone really appreciates being spoken to first rather than this is the decision, it's happening, deal with it. If you can actually include people ahead of time, I've actually found that some of my people that I thought were going to be my biggest roadblocks turned into some of my biggest allies when I could really sit down and talk with them and say, yes, this looks like a problem on its face, but let me show you how it's going to help all of us as a whole, and let me show you how I can help mitigate some of the work that is going to be put on your plate by my proposing this. So it could be a give and take. It could be just a reciprocity thing. But again, I feel like the biggest takeaway from at least this question is to include someone, have them in a conversation, because if you just move forward with a solution and let's say that person's boss comes to them and says this is happening, deal with it, no one appreciates that, and no one really will. That might breed resentment, and it will make things harder down the road. And as an organization, you want to be able to have good working relationships with your colleagues in other departments, because everyone depends on everyone else. It's very much a web, and it definitely means you don't want to ruffle feathers. So by talking with people ahead of time, including them in discussion, you'll be in a much better place.
Great advice, Denver. It's really helpful. The other thing that I do a lot of thinking about is the the unseen cost of human capital. One thing that we hear all the time with certain some study abroad offices is that things like turnover and the not having people in positions that need to be filled has a really negative impact on a working environment. The cost, typically the short-term investment of technology compared to the risk of employee turnover or having the wrong people in the wrong places, typically that investment in technology is worth it every time. I think that there's a statistic that the average cost of turnover, it's at the very least $10,000 in terms of the resources to replace someone and the opportunity loss with somebody not being in a role. And so when framed
Alex, I think we may have lost you there, but just to pick up where you cut out there, I heard you talking about the opportunity cost of turnover of staff, which is definitely an important consideration. Having the right technological solutions in place to help mitigate that loss when you do have staff turnover is very important. It could be something as simple as making sure that you have a living document that is a record of what each person does and their roles and responsibilities, because turnover is inevitable. No one stays in any one position for forever. And so having the right tools in place to really make sure that their role can be taken on when you are down a team member, it's very important. And sometimes it means advocating for the resources to make that happen. It could be budgeting time to really ask people to create those mini handbooks for who they are, what they do, what their role is, and how it connects with other people on campus. Again, that is very important. So if you're still there, I may have lost you here, but just in case. And it looks like there was one other question about common timeline events when advocating for technology. How long does the process usually take? Which is a great question. Basically, one of the things that you can look at is it really just depends on what the technology is and how big the scope of the project is. It could be involving one budgetary cycle or 1 year, or it could be a multiple year project. It really just depends on how big it is. And that's a great question, and really you can only really get to the bottom of that by, again, going to the very beginning of the advocacy planning cycle and really thinking about what is the issue and performing an analysis. And that means sitting down with other people that are impacted by this issue and saying, okay, what do we want to do? Where do we want to go with this? How big does it look? And setting objectives to say, this is what it looks like when it's done or finished. This is what it looks like when we've crossed the finish line. And that's going to be institution specific. It could be something simple, like let's say you needed an email marketing solution to reach lots of students that are going to study abroad for a given semester. It could be something as simple as utilizing your university's email system, or using a third-party email system to reach everybody. Or it could be something that is a very large question, like implementing a CRM or a constituent management software solution. That would be a huge undertaking. Again, the timetable or cycle really just depends on the scope of the project. And these 10 steps that WaterAid puts forward could go very quickly, or it could be a very long, drawn-out process. It just depends. So I think if anyone else has any more questions, we'll be happy to take those, but I think this might be a place to wrap up.
Yep, I think we might be all set. Thank you, Denver, so much for joining us. Hopefully you can hear me. Sorry I cut out there for a little bit. But I think that really to sum it up, I mean, this is a phenomenal framework. I would say not just for advocating for technology, but really for anything. This is a pretty comprehensive approach for, I mean, really sales in general, to make sure that you're accounting for all the angles, looping in those people who might be your roadblocks and turning them into your advocates. I think it's a phenomenal way of approaching the laying that foundation to make sure that you're maximizing that opportunity. Great. Well, I think if we don't have any other questions, thank you guys so much for joining us. I forgot to mention at the beginning, we are recording this webinar and we'll be posting it up to the TechMig website. That is nafsatechmig.com, and we'll be sending it out to the listservs shortly thereafter. For you to reference and use as a resource and forward along to your colleagues so they can advocate for their own technology. Thank you so much, Denver, for presenting. This was really helpful. And for everyone that attended, we will look forward to seeing you on the next webinar in early January. More details on that to come. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.